information about the beginning of the Revolutionary War. And I'd like to take you back to the fact that, you know, we were all loyal British subjects. Even before the general and I were married, we were all loyal British subjects. And until the king started to create hardships for us and he taxed us without us having a say.
Because in 1758, I resigned my commission as a colonel from that French and Indian War, and I returned home to Mount Vernon. My two prime concerns at that time were getting Mount Vernon back into a profitable situation and my recent marriage to the widow Custis and taking care of her two children, Jackie and Patsy. Our 5 farms at Mount Vernon were in a state of neglect, I suppose with me having been away serving during the war. However, you know, our cash crop was tobacco, and it was declining in value. So I began experimenting with other crops, and wheat became a new cash crop. I even opened a grist mill to eliminate the middleman, but no matter what I seemed to do, the mother country kept us in a difficult situation financially. You see, she thought that she had to tax us to help us pay off the debt that was encouraged during that French Indian War. So she passed the Stamp Act, Sugar Act, and those towns duties which taxed many of our basic necessities: lead, paint, glass, dye, and even our tea. Yes, most of those taxes were repealed. But if you go back to 1607, when the first British subjects came to this new land for opportunity and freedom and settled in Jamestown, Virginia, from then till now, over 160 years has passed, and we were pretty much left on our own as far as governing, taxing, and running our own personal affairs. So these new taxes, without us having any voice in them, were seen quite as an imposition.
Well, unrest was getting much worse, and I could tell that change was just around the corner. As the Sons of Liberty formed and started to protest the tea tax, a group of women decided to form, and they called themselves the Daughters of Liberty. Now, this surprised the colonial men and the British as well, because you see, women were not involved in politics. But up and down the colonies, groups of women continued to form, and they began to create their own protests of English-grown tea and British-made clothing. I initially didn't support those protests, and some even accused me of being a loyalist. No, I think that's because earlier I had 2 brothers and an uncle in the Royal Navy, and I belonged to Williamsburg Court, and they did not support any protests.
Yes, the colonists of all the colonies got involved in the protest, it seemed, in some way, shape, or form. It went from tar and feathering the local tax collectors, that would discourage anyone else from taking that position, to writing letters of redress for our grievances to the King and Parliament. But most just protested by refusing to buy any British-made products that were being taxed and shipped over here. Yes, I know, the worst protests were in the Boston area. There was a group of patriots one day protesting a tax. They were halted by the British redcoats. Shots were fired, and 5 of those innocent patriots lay dead in the street. Some called that the Boston Massacre. Then sometime after that, there were 3 ships in Boston Harbor with goods that were taxable products that come from England. The good citizens of Boston refused to unload that ship. The governor of Massachusetts insisted it be unloaded. So one December night, a group you may have heard of, the Liberty Boys, they dressed up as Indians and went on board the ship and threw over 300 chests into Boston Harbor. Well, that became known as the Boston Tea Party. But the king saw no amusement in that, as he passed the coercive acts. We call it the Intolerable Acts, where they closed the port of Boston, which greatly crippled our economy. And they took control of the Massachusetts government and the Massachusetts courts. They even made them pay for the tea that was thrown overboard. Is it any wonder it caught the attention of all the colonies? I mean, who's going to be next to suffer the wrath of the king?
Well, I feel I must explain why initially I didn't support any of the protests. You see, we were intent to maintain our daughter Patsy's social standing, so I continued to order her clothing from London. But we soon realized that the price and quality of those goods weren't as they used to be, and the mother country wasn't sending us fine things as she once did. Well, this became very unimportant. In 1773, we lost our dear Patsy at age 17 to a severe seizure.
Being in a long state of mourning, This was no time for me to be leaving home. But the leadership of the colonies called for a meeting in Philadelphia of all the colonies so we could come together and discuss the common problems we're having with the mother country. I was chosen to be a representative of Virginia, so as duty called, I was off to Philadelphia. It became known as the Continental Congress. Once there, we discussed our rights as British subjects and what we could do to get our rights back. And these protests that were going on throughout the colonies, were they doing us any good or were they doing more harm? Well, I was only back in Mount Vernon a short period of time. We heard of another insurrection outside of Boston, this time at Lexington and Concord. There was much bloodshed that day. It wouldn't be long, though, till there was a second Continental Congress called for in Philadelphia. And again, I was chosen to represent my Virginia. Once there, it was soon determined that we had to have a Continental Army. That's an army made up of troops of all 13 colonies, not just a militia group up around New England and Boston. John Adams stood, and he proposed that I should be the commander-in-chief of that Continental Army. I said, I hope me wearing my uniform to every session didn't influence your decision. They said not. Me being a Southerner from Virginia, and the problems being up in New England, I would be a unifying factor. And likewise, my experience being part of the government of Virginia through the House of Burgesses, I would know how to work with Congress. And my years during the French and Indian War, I learned how to work with the Army and its officers. Well, I declared with utmost sincerity, I did not think myself equal to the command I was being honored, but I agreed to accept without pay, only to be reimbursed for my expenses.
Well, in June of 1775, I received the news that I considered as very bad news. It took George 3 days to sit down and write to me and tell me that due to his sense of duty, he was unable to decline the appointment of Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Now, I had many family, friends, and servants surrounding me, but never did I feel so alone, because alone to me meant being without him.
I know I should have left Philadelphia and went straight home to Mount Vernon and given a proper farewell and goodbye to my Patsy and the rest of my family. But I also knew that new army was awaiting my presence and my leadership. They were on the hills of Cambridge outside of Boston, keeping a watchful eye on the British. So I headed north. When I got to New York City, I got information of another battle they fought before my arrival up in that area. It was called the Battle of Bunker Hill. And I was told there'd be 18 to 20,000 troops there to join me. When I got to Cambridge, I only found about 14,000 fit to fight. They were poorly disciplined, poorly trained, sleeping under the stars, very poorly equipped, and many of them were drunkards. And Congress had promised me that we'd have 300 barrels of gunpowder to use. We only found 90 barrels. That meant we had about 9 shots per man. We're facing the strongest army in the world with 9 shots per man, an ominous task indeed. Well, the leadership that had been there for the 3 previous battles before my arrival, they said if I'd been there 2 weeks earlier at Bunker Hill, I wouldn't have felt that way. At Bunker Hill, they were down 5 shots per man and pretty much held their own. But you may know the battle cry up there. Don't shoot till you see the whites of their eyes. Well, indeed, many of the troops that I first met were suffering from illnesses. Many were suffering wounds from those first 3 battles. And not to mention, they were being paid less than $7 a month if they got paid anything at all. And then again, they'd only signed up for 1-year enlistments, some 60 or 90 days before they would be going back home to their farms and families. And yes, even before my arrival, many of my troops had headed home to their farms. This ragtag group we're talking about is the start of your Continental Army.
Well, George